Thank you all and good evening. I hope you all had your cups of tea and are energized and will be able to ask the ambassador some tough questions. I was telling them that the environment is not necessarily my domain area of expertise or experience, but diplomacy is. I've been reporting on Indian diplomacy for the better part of my journalistic career. And so I guess this is an area where journalism and diplomacy might actually come together on stage. So thank you, Ambassador, for actually giving this time that you have this evening. Our conversation really is about, I want to flip it around and say it's about the environment, how the environment is reported upon, but also the media environment that we inhabit today. I think we can sort of play on that word a little bit. So before we go into the nitty-gritties of your career as a journalist before you were a diplomat as well, tell us what your observations are about the global media environment right now.
Well, that was a very big question and I think it's very difficult to answer it also, because I don't think it is one answer. But and this will of course just be a layman view. My feeling is that you have strong fact-based medias, and I don't think that has been weakened. That's here in India also. But you have much more also of this very noisy kind of entertainment kind of media. But there is. I technically am a historian by education, and when I wrote my thesis, I was reading lots of old newspapers, and many years back, that was really when it was quality. That's the lost childhood, but it wasn't. I would say in general, the good newspapers today, for instance, good TV channels today, are in many ways better than many of them were at that time. But it's a bigger, educated audience also you can talk to, so that there is more space for that kind of thing. But it's probably, on the other hand, the very noisy, uninformed, sensation-driven media probably has a much bigger place than before. But it's not like kind of media suddenly has lost this innocence, I'd say.
Is that the same case in Norway as well?
Yeah, I would say that's the case. Although I will maybe say that there are some elements which I see in some other countries. For instance, the kind of TV debates and where you have 10 people talking over each other and so forth. That's unknown to us, I must say. That's
unknown to you?
Yeah.
All right. So welcome to India, I suppose, given that you said that's unknown to you. But let's just move on a little bit into the area we're really here to talk about today, which is also reporting that you have done. First of all, tell us about your career as a journalist, or your days as a journalist, and why you decided to move from that into diplomacy.
Well, I didn't actually know that I had on my CV at all that I had worked as a journalist. So that.
Oh, you did some reporting, right? Yeah.
No, I actually worked at the university newspaper, and I also wrote sketches for the national broadcasting for a while. So that was more, and my writing was more commentary and things like that. But I had the choice when I finished university. I was offered a job as a news journalist, and in the end, I ended up
on the other side.
Yeah.
On the other side. On the issue of the environment and reporting on areas that are not necessarily, day-to-day politics and politicking, perhaps, we tend to find that news about the environment often only makes it to the headlines, the front pages, when there is the threat of imminent disaster or something has taken place that's grave and demands public attention. Otherwise, given the fact that global conversations around climate change, the Paris Agreement, global warming, new technologies, clean energy, things like that are, they're part of conversation in day-to-day discourse, but they don't make it to media attention. Do you have a view on why that is?
Well, I think this is the problem for any journalist in a way to deal with issues. If you take climate change, which may be the most important challenge we have in this century, but you know you're talking about threats which are 20, 30, 40 years ahead, and to sell the urgency of that is very difficult. That's the same problem for the politicians in a way. You know, also for politicians to prepare policies which are, you know, give effect maybe of 10, 15 years, long time after your election period is over. That's difficult. That's challenging. That's a very brave politician who does that. And I think that's the challenge for the media also. Having said that, I think in many ways, if I look globally on it, media has been active and played an important role in getting the fact that there is, in most countries, an acceptance that climate change is real, and that it is important. But it is also, as Al Gore called his film about the climate change, it's an inconvenient truth, because if we are going to be effectively combating climate change, we have to make changes which actually affect our lives. And you know, it's very difficult for many of us to do something which maybe which is inconvenient. Travel, less planes, not using private cars, whatever. When this change again, it doesn't really matter for today. It's the way we will think. Yeah.
But I think, you know, when we talk about looking at the future, no politician really wants to put today's career on the line for something that may be seemingly unpopular or lose him or her votes today for a future good. That's one part of the story. The other part is in international negotiations or international coverage, when the sort of world media community talks about issues like this. We've seen how negotiations, whether it's at the WTO, whether it's over the Paris Agreement, things like that, where developing nations have a particular view and the developed world has one view. So historic responsibility, the issue of historic responsibility. How can the challenges that poses to diplomacy be reconciled with the needs of developing nations, the economic needs, the developmental needs, the technology needs? And how does that get represented or reflected in the writing or journalistic discourse about this?
Well, again, this is first, it's both interesting and challenging to write about this, because complex issues are difficult to popularize. That's one thing about it. And often with, you know, what is the most efficient policies? Where should we start? Where should we use our resources? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. They're not, you see, you do this and this, and that will have no effect whatsoever. I mean, we have an interesting situation just in Norway now, and you have it many other countries also. But for instance, clearly we need to produce more renewables. Although Norway itself is lucky because we get 98% of our electricity from hydropower. But we are building big windmills also for exporting to the rest of the continent. That is very important if we are going to combat climate change. At the same time, what we have seen lots of protests locally about it, because again it clashes against the for instance, a focus on, for instance, trying to preserve nature, which has always been very strong in Norway, and also been one of the reasons why we came early out focusing on, for instance, on climate change. But here you are then in a situation that this is a very efficient remedy long term, but at the same time, you pay a price for it. It is not free, and I mean you can come with the same argument when it comes to the international negotiations, for instance, about finding when it comes to situation between developing and developed countries. And I think what is important here is again to focus on some of the contradictions. If you look at for instance, if you compare Norway and India on this issue, if you go by IEA figures, the highest share of the energy demand, growth of the energy demand globally over the next 30 years will come from India. So clearly, whether we are going to succeed in reducing the effects on climate change, it's dependent on India succeeding. You could say India and China together, and that's really the key. While for instance, a country like Norway, 0.4% of world population, or even less than that, in itself doesn't make any change at all. But what we try to do also in our cooperation, for instance, with India, where this is one of the areas where we are focusing, is actually that we can be, being a highly developed country, we can be a laboratory. We can afford to make mistakes, try out technologies, and learn from that. And so from that point of view, some of our experiences can then be exported here instead without the mistakes, which you do. Take an example as, for instance, electric vehicles. I mean, we have the biggest share of electrical vehicles anywhere in the world. We don't produce the cars. Actually, we did, but started too early, so there was no market for it. So that broke. But what we have is that we have a lot of experience on how do you get people to buy it, but basically also how do you buy infrastructure for it, and what are people as consumers, what do they need to do for changing, for instance, from one to the other. So that's, and what kind of legislations do we need to have, what kind of changes do we have. So that kind of experience can then be exported here, while we, as you always have, if you have the first mover on a new technology, we have paid a very high price in one way for succeeding with this policy, but that's okay, kind of.
And yet, when it comes to the question of sharing technologies or passing them on to countries like India and China, which are now the lion's share of the population, of industry, of manufacturing, things like that, global regimes, technology sharing regimes, trade regimes, things like that become or to have become sort of blocked because of the different views and different demands from these two countries in particular, from China and India in particular as well. In the past, we saw that it took a fair amount of deft diplomacy and negotiation at the Paris Agreement, for example, when India actually went ahead and said, all right, fine, we sign on to certain parts of it. But then you have a US president who walks in and says, America is walking out of this, climate change doesn't exist. And a country like India is saying, well, you forced this country with all its developmental needs to sign on to an agreement where the lead country is now walking out of it. So how do countries like Norway then deal with that kind of drama in diplomacy, really, when it comes to these critical issues?
Well, when in diplomacy and hopefully in life otherwise also, if you face a problem like that, you see how you can work around it. Because I think for the first thing, you are in a situation, if you look at from India's point of view also, India is one of the countries which will pay the highest price if we are not succeeding with it. So it's about India's future also. So it isn't a one-to-one relationship. The second thing is then that even if you have United States going out, it's possible to, for instance, for others to be the norm setters. And for instance, when it comes to trade, you see, just after America pulled out of the agreement, you got 300 big companies in United States. You had state of California and so forth, who said that they would be acting according to this agreement. So you can also build international agreements in such a way that these things are taken into consideration. Trade agreements, for instance, some of the things where, for instance, developing countries have reacted when it comes to WTO is standards, but standards can work both ways.
Right.
So you have to be flexible on this thing, and I don't think in the long run that the Americans either will be free riders on a system like this.
Well, I come back to the question of historic responsibility as well. Understood that, population imperatives are very different in the developed world versus the developing world right now in these two countries. But how do you foresee countries like India going forward and adopting regimes or technologies that might actually fit into a global sort of compact, so to speak, on preserving the environment, on making sure that we don't cross over that 2-degree window as far as climate change is concerned? Where do you see that happening? Can we leapfrog on technologies? Can we do that? I mean, what is your solution inside?
Yeah, no, I think first thing I think is what you should continue what you did in Paris in the way that, because much of the criticism against India sometimes in international organization is that India's prefer to stand a bit on the sideline criticizing. What India did in Paris was to try to be among the leaders on framing this thing, and I think that's very important, to be ambitious in framing the whole discussion. And India has the heft, it has the to be able to do that, and understanding to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, yes, I think also these huge changes we are facing now, they represent big opportunities for technology shift. We are, just to take one example, we have research program together with the Indian institutions when it comes to finding more environmentally friendly air conditioners. But is this important for India? Well, it's important because only 7% of Indian families have air conditioners today, and we know that when people move into middle class, the first thing many of them buy is an air conditioner. So just think about it. If we are able to succeed with that, what kind of impact that will have. And so this is also the fact that the needs are so strong, also should be a driver for change of technology. And I think it's important to see that I mean, basically, there have been lots of bad news when it comes to the climate change happening maybe faster than expected. And I mean, Norway is one of the places we see it the most. Up in the north, the change is much faster than other places. But at the same time, we have also seen that. Take for instance solar power. Mm-hmm. I mean, the price of renewables today compared to what they were 5 years ago has been a massive change, which also means that a number of the prognosis for how, for instance, consumption patterns would develop have turned out to be too pessimistic. Doesn't mean that this will not be very challenging still, because with all the prognosis now, the demand for oil and gas will continue to grow to 2040. Mm-hmm. But it shows that there are big possibilities in making leaps of changes when it comes to development of technology. And it's very difficult to see that part of the a solution where improved technology is not an important part of that.
So, given that fact that we're talking about the challenges going forward, and when we as journalists approach a story, the challenges are what become the lead. They become the headline, whether it's diplomatic challenges, whether it's developmental challenges, whether it's price and trade challenges, whatever it might be. But the need to overcome that hump. Now, in India, and since you talked about how India took the lead in the Paris negotiations as well, because it had a view it wanted to ensure was heard on the world stage, even if that was an unpopular view globally. We're in a strange age of politics as well. So where is the linkage or the interlinkage or the intersectionality between populist politics, rule of law, and issues that impact citizenry, like challenges to the environment, like climate change? And I'll give you an example of why I'm asking this question. I think it was in today's newspaper in Delhi, where there is a missive from the Delhi government saying that they're going to slash or give free power to people who use less than a certain amount of power every month in their homes. Somebody has to pay for that free power. It may not be the person who's consuming it, but somebody is making that payment. So I think the idea that resources are not infinite, that they cost money, gets lost because politicians want to win elections as well.
That's true, but I just read quickly this story on New Delhi, but you could see a situation where you could give some free electricity for a minimum and the others pay more. But clearly you would have to. On the one hand, electricity is a common good. On the other hand, if you are not able to increase the prices on it, because that's the most efficient way we have to try to limit the usage. But I'm not ready to kind of say one thing or the other about that.
The principle in general, I mean, whether it's about water, people assume that water is a free public good, but water is drying up across the globe. So how do we go about trying to conserve water? We talk about air pollution in a city like Delhi, and what that's doing to temperatures, what that's doing to the air we breathe, to our health. And yet, come Diwali every year, when there is a chorus of people speaking out about firecrackers, for example, you'll have another lot of people who say, why are you questioning the use of firecrackers? It's to celebrate a festival. Now, I'm not batting for either side. I'm just simply saying that when the political climate is so divided, then even an issue that requires people to come together is prone to falling victim to that kind of division.
That's true, but that's where also media has a responsibility in setting the agenda. Because journalists can decide what is important, what should be on the front page, what should be the first issue on the news. I mean, because that's basically why we prefer the edited media to just social media, is actually that they have a view on what is important and not important. And let me take something which I have thought have been encouraging here in India, then, since you mentioned water. I mean, the water scarcity, clearly you need to have policy changes there. Clearly it's a common good you will have to pay for one way or another, otherwise you will grow sugar cane where you never should grow sugar cane, rice where you don't do that. But here you have a situation where Niti Aayog, being a think tank for the government, makes thoroughly studies and looking forward planning. And the media, I think, has been very good when we got the droughts coming on, actually to writing long articles where they try to, and having things on the TV where they try to explain to us commoners what are the challenges and how can it be dealt with. Well, to move from there to make policy changes, that's of course a good step, but to establish the kind of recognition that actually is important, that's a key. It's like if you took climate change.
Yeah.
I know it's still, in some countries it's disputed, but generally in most countries would say that this is happening. And how did they do that? I think it was a very good way, because the governments decided, instead of diplomats like me who can only, have very superficial knowledge about very many things.
Bring in the experts.
You bring in the expert, you bring in experts from all over the world, and they come up with recommendations which we today say 97% consensus on something. So you have you establish the fact base. You establish then, and then it is, among others, for media also to try to convey those things.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to take some questions, but I want to just leave you with a thought before we go to the questions. You made that point about edited media and why you prefer it. Edited media today is often taking cues from social media. So while you will have an opinion piece talk about the need for saving the environment or what kind of steps can be taken on an issue like pollution, for example, you'll have another voice on the same page, sort of a for and against. And I don't know whether that kind of false equivalency that's being created is really, I mean, that's a question the media needs to ask itself, I think, taking on from your point. But a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah.
I would just, I think this is a question for the way the media sort of chooses its stories. I like the edited media point that the ambassador just made. I'm going to use that line henceforth.
You and a lot of us.
I represent a think tank, and I'm very keen to understand, and we work, as you know, with climate, energy, and resources. What is it that we need to say better? The experts need to say better, and what should we say so that most of these conversations, which actually affect a lot of us, but is still not mainstream. I mean, you talked about mainstream and you talked about negotiations, which is very far from people's lives, whereas electricity is very close to our lives. What should experts and media sort of get into a huddle and discuss so climate change and energy use becomes a little more mainstream? It's open to both of you.
I think I'll let the ambassador try and take that question.
Well,
I'll get into trouble if I try and answer it.
I think that actually it's your question, because I have wondered often about the same thing. I mean, when we as government come up with policies we think are very important to convey on positions like this, it's very often very difficult to get media to take it, and you often ask the question, why isn't this important?
Yeah.
So I must say that I full-heartedly follow your thinking, but unfortunately, if I had the answer, I would have been much more efficient in putting forward our positions on a number of things to the media.
I think, I mean, if you want me to just take that for a minute, the real challenge really is, I mean, I was lucky to work in a news organization that prioritized a lot of other news apart from just political news. But I see that shift taking place even in that organization today. And I think that's driven by the revenue model that most media houses are victim to. And I think there is a dire need within the media industry to re-evaluate revenue models. We come from, and since you and I are from the same school and had the same teachers, I know you agree with me, we come from a school of thought that said journalism is a public good. We're actually doing something which creates awareness, which spreads information, which highlights injustice. I think that definition of journalism needs to be re-emphasized, recalibrated, and working with a revenue model where that is not compromised. I think that's a big challenge. I don't have the answer. I'm just telling you that that's my identification of the problem. Any other questions?
And I just wanted to ask you, because of course your country has been obviously at the forefront of such issues of climate change, but largely amongst the Norwegian public, what is the view about India's large energy demands? I'm sure you have addressed this question, but if you could reiterate on, in simpler terms, on what is the public perception amongst your countrymen about India's huge energy needs and its requirement to, fulfill its, or try to reach the place where you've already reached in terms of development?
Well, if I should be perfectly frank, I think most of them don't know much about it. That's a kind of the reality. In fact, in spite of the fact that I would say that we have more foreign news, maybe in Norway than many other places, but what I register when I come home in the vacations is that It may be because I'm getting older. I have the feeling that it's less foreign news than it used to do. So I would say that there is a general feeling that it's very important that the developed world is helping the developed world, developing world, because it's climate change as a challenge is very well established in Norway, and that's what we also see, and that you see in parts of Europe just this year, is that, for instance, green parties are getting much more support than they've had before. So and that's a very interesting development, and we have seen just the last year that change has been there. But it's an interesting thing also with this, just to show that this is difficult, because Norway, for instance, spends lots of money on trying to combat climate change, developing alternative technologies, for instance. We are trying to find systems where you can clean CO2 out and then put it down in the soil. I mean, we have spent a couple of $1 billion on these experiments, which still we haven't been able to develop the technology and all these things. But we have ambitious goals on reducing our own emissions over the next 20, 30 years. But they are very costly for every kilo of CO2 we reduce. If we wanted to have some kind of, if we should have maximum effect, we should send all of the money to send a big check to India and said, please use this smartly on climate change, because we would get much more out of it. So, it's a difficult balancing point, but if we did that, we would not be able to achieve our own goals. So so I'm in a situation there are not clear answers. We see very clearly the needs. We see clearly, for instance, a country like India, where you have very low energy usage per capita compared to others, so you will have a big growth, and clearly it's unfair if India in some ways, because the rest of us have spent up most of the kind of what is available space for CO2 emissions. So it is important to find models where we can assist India. But I think realistically, the way the situation is, economic situation in many countries and so forth, is that can only be, economic support can only be a part of it. More important will probably be, for instance, to assist in developing technologies and so forth. Because I think realistically, when we see how things develop, technology development is very important, and then maybe also focusing on some of the technologies which are very important also for instance, energy usages here.
Right. I think that also kind of goes back to the question of historic responsibility and developmental needs of the developing world that I was asking about earlier. But scalability, that's right. Right. Can we take one more question? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this is more from a social perspective. Are your younger people in Norway more invested in making alternate, more sustainable choices? And is there a campaign that you all have run that you could share with us?
Yeah, I clearly think that I don't know, when I look at polls and things like that, and I don't see a big change between the generations. But what we have seen lately is we have had big mobilizations in lots of countries in Europe. You have had day strike against on school students against climate change. We have seen, for instance, this Greta Thunberg, this Swedish kid of 15, 16-year-old, who has become a icon for the movement. So at the time being, clearly there is a move, but I'm a bit careful in one way to kind of conclude on that, because very many of these kind of movements among young people, as we know ourselves from way back, they have a tendency to fizzle out sometimes. Hopefully this is not one of those where it is fizzling out, and we can see when it comes to party preferences, for instance, if you look at there, they have a tendency to vote more with the Greens and so forth. But how sustainable this development is, I don't know, and that also reflects something else, and this is a more broader comment in democracies, is that what we see is that political tendencies are much less stable today than they used to be. The divisions in society and so forth are also changing. So I hesitate a bit to be kind of to draw too strong conclusions about it.
Also, I think the political tendencies thrive on these divisions, and politicians thrive on these divisions, and that's a whole different conversation, I think. I wish we had time to have that conversation as well. But thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming to the Media Rumble and speaking to this group. Thanks a lot.